Welcome everyone to another edition of Play It Through, and on this edition it's the Smurfs, brought to us by Infograms. The Smurfs is an action platformer released in 1994 for the NES and PAL territories only. During this time period, there were actually a good amount of Smurfs-related video games released. This one is a decent platformer that has a few quirks here and there, and overall a great soundtrack that goes along with the game. There's 3 different difficulties. I'll be playing it on the hardest difficulty here, and the game is relatively short. I also used to speedrun the game, so I'm very familiar with it. The first level of the game is the forest. We're going to start off by running over to the right side here, jumping over a lot of the evil Smurfs, as well as the acorns that are flying out of the trees. For the most part, we can run underneath a lot of them. You have to make some big, giant leaps throughout the course of the game, so get used to that here. You can jump on the heads of certain enemies and bounce off of them, but not every enemy you can jump on, so sometimes being safe is the best strategy. You'll notice in the upper left corner you have your health meter, which is represented by the hearts, the total amount of lives you have, and then the leaves, which are basically the coins that you're able to collect throughout the course of the game. Thankfully, the game changes things up to keep it interesting. There's a few vehicle-style levels throughout, and the first of these is the log-riding river level. Here we have to move our Smurf on this log in between all the other giant logs that will prevent you from progressing and potentially squashing you off-screen, as well as, of course, a few enemies including fish that are hungry to eat the poor Smurfs. Overall, a pretty straightforward path. You can actually hug the very bottom of the log a lot of times and go directly over the fish. It's kind of a weird hitbox as far as actually getting hit when you're riding this log. As long as you're able to pretty much stop from getting squashed, it won't take you long in order to make your way through the rapids, and we're moving on to the third level. And this is where things start to get a lot more difficult. We're back to platforming here in the swamps, but grabbing on to the various vines can be a bit difficult. You'll also have to wait for frogs to pop out of the water so that you'll be able to jump on top of them and get across gaps. And the same goes for the mosquitoes that are, I guess, drinking up the very disgusting looking swamp water that is below us. The little circling flies, though, you can bounce off their heads and get across some gaps using a nicely timed jump with them. For the most part, a lot of the vines I'm going to avoid even grabbing onto, but there are a few occasionally that you have to. However, when you're doing certain jumps, you may actually attach yourself to the vine even when you don't want to, and just pressing the buttons you may end up falling off down into the water. Completing the swamps, though, leads to the first boss encounter of the game. The first boss of the game is Gargamel's cat, Azrael. In order to hit him, you have to jump on his head. Wherever you are, he'll do a big giant leap towards wherever you are, so trying to get him to not land directly on you can be difficult. It's very, very finicky hit detection. In fact, this is the worst as far as the hit detection is concerned in the game. It doesn't take too many jumps on his head in order to defeat him, grabbing the key and saving Brainy, but it's a pretty frustrating fight. Honestly, the most frustrating outside of the final boss. The next level has you inside of a weird cave-like structure, the Barilla Field as they call it. Here there's a bunch of little spiders moving, water droplets coming down from the ceiling, which can end up damaging you. You'll need to use leaves in order to get up to some higher platforms, as it can be difficult to actually make certain jumps. Wait for the right moments between the spiders moving so that you'll be able to progress. Here you have a bouncing rock-like item that moves around. Thankfully you can just kind of see where the trajectory of it's going to go and be able to get past. There's a few giant gaps in the level that you can use the leaves to help you out. If you want to use a shortcut, you can just make it across with a normal jump, but you have to time it exactly right, basically on the very, very edge of the platform in order to make enough distance to get past. At the very end, watch out for the couple of bugs and another water droplet to finish up Act number 4. Level number 5 is another one of the vehicle style of levels. Here we're riding on a Stork. You can see clouds up above us that will fire out lightning bolts down towards us, and there's a few different variety of birds that are going to try to stop our progress. You have the black ones moving up and down and left and right, and then the green birds that will fly overhead and drop little rocks or acorns down on top of you. Do your best to try to get around them so that you won't end up having them land directly on you. You can also get crushed just like we did in the previous level with the river, so be careful that you don't end up having that happen. And there's a few objects and items that you can collect along the way to break up the monotony of just dodging all the birds. Just like the previous river level, it's not an extremely long situation that we'll have at our hands before eventually making it to the end and moving on to the next stage. Act number 6 is the mountains, and this is a relatively difficult level till you figure things out. There's a couple of platforming areas that can be a pain. You'll have to use the birds in order to get across a lot of the gaps, and you have these springs that you can actually pick up, and you need to do so in order to move them to another platform so that you can then get up onto the bird here. This is something that actually took me a while to figure out the very first time I ever played the game. There's also rolling balls down the various snowy hills that you'll have to avoid. Thankfully, keep an eye out for any of the raspberry-like berries that are set up so that you can refill your health in case you've lost any. Once again, pick up the spring, and you actually need to carry it with you across this big gap with the birds, and then use it right here, and if you do it just right, you'll barely be able to make it across that gap. Easily the hardest jump in the entire game. Continue using the birds over the last little bit of the level, finishing it up and moving on to the next vehicle level, which is us inside of a minecart. In the minecart, you can speed up and slow down, as well as, of course, jump in it so that you can avoid a lot of the rocks and the falling water droplets throughout the course of it. Your biggest threat is pretty much going to be the pits, as if you go too long on certain tracks, it'll break up and you'll end up running into them. There's a few items, just like in the other levels, that you can grab along the way if you want to, but just kind of keep an eye on what's coming ahead of you so that you can prepare your jumps correctly so you don't end up jumping directly into the rocks and water droplets just like I did there, but thankfully there's a set of berries right nearby so I'm able to replenish some of my health. The game doesn't feature any sort of continue system, but since it does have passwords, it's very easy to get back to whatever previous level you just completed when you do run out of lives. After completing Act 7 though, we have the next boss fight, which is against a dragon. Here we have to pick up these presents and take them across the gap and throw them at the dragon. This took a little while to get used to. The trajectory of the presents once you end up launching them is a bit off, and if you're just a little bit too early, you'll end up missing the dragon. You also have the flames that end up hitting the platforms, and there is at least one flame going pretty much at all times, and usually the one at the very top, like the one right here, can be difficult to actually get out of the way of when you're trying to make some of these jumps. Once you deliver enough presents though, the present becomes a key, and then you can pick up the key and then jump on top of the dragon's head in order to get up and save Jokey Smurf. We're now getting to the near end of the game, the final few levels here. Surprisingly, I know, but it's a relatively short game like I mentioned before. Act number 8 is the Sledge Race. Here we're trying to get down the mountain, I guess, that we climbed up in order to get to wherever Jokey was. This is a difficult level. Timing your jumps to make sure that you're able to get across the gaps will take a little bit of timing. Also, of course, there's some enemies along the way that you can bounce off of, and mistiming your jump may end up causing you to run directly into these guys, which can also be pretty annoying. You also need to make sure that you have enough momentum on some of the slidey hills that you'll be able to get across these gaps. So, a little bit of practice and a few deaths, and you should be able to start getting a better hang of what needs to be done so you can make it across the longer gaps. Thankfully, like many levels in the game, it's pretty short, and we're moving on to the next stage. Act number 9 is the bridge. This is a pretty straightforward level. In fact, it's one of the easier ones, especially for this far into the game. There are some birds that you have to use for platforms similar to what we did on the mountain area earlier, and some fish jumping out of the water that will try to grab you. Run across the bridge that will break apart, but as long as you keep a steady speed, you'll be able to easily run across the bridge before falling down into the water below. There's also little rocks or logs that are in the water that you can use in order to help you progress as well. Making it to the end of the stage, we're on the home stretch now, as we've made it to Gargamel's house, or Gargamel's castle, and now it's time to traverse through it before eventually running into Gargamel himself. This level actually has you going from right to left instead of left to right, which is always an interesting change in a platformer. There's a bunch of bugs and the evil Smurfs that are going to be bouncing around that we have to deal with. Keep heading to the left, watching out for a couple of the plants, these little piranha plants that are kind of snapping at you. They do end up damaging you, even though they are pretty small. You also have to use springs, like we did earlier on in the game, in order to get across a couple of these spots. Like right here, you can use it in order to bounce up over to this cauldron. Then pick up this spring and use it in order to drop right before the cauldron and then bounce over it. Thankfully, the cauldron's not instant death though, so if you want to take a hit, you could do so and just kind of get past that area a little bit quicker. There is some health along the level, so you can replenish some of it. The final boss of the game is Gargamel, and to defeat him, it takes a lot of practice and timing in order to get it done. Basically, we have to have this bird drop acorns onto the left side of this teeter-totter and then send it flying into Gargamel, basically, I guess, choking him as it lands inside his mouth, I guess? This is pretty hard to get them to go exactly where you need it to in order to launch them fast enough. If Gargamel even runs into you, it's instant death. It doesn't take too many hits though with the acorns to defeat him, but getting this timing down will probably take you a time or two. Once he's defeated, you've saved Smurfette and can enjoy the brief ending to Smurfs on the NES. So there you have it, Smurfs on the NES. Like I mentioned before, the game was released in 1994, pretty late in the NES life, so it's not really a shock that it didn't make it over to North America. There was several Smurfs-related games released during this time, including ones for the Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, Sega CD, Game Gear, PC, and Game Boy. While the game is far from an instant classic by any means, and I don't think we really lost out in North America by not having this game come over, it does have some great music and is an overall fun little platformer if you're looking for a new one to get into. After the credits end up rolling by though, we have the end with our score at the bottom, but with that guys, it will wrap up this episode of Play It Through. I'd like to thank you for watching, and of course, I hope you enjoyed.